Hey everyone, welcome back to the QC guy, and today we're doing the complete economics crash course. Sorry, it's a bit last minute at 5:40 p.m. on the night before the exam, but I hope you guys find it useful. So once again, my apologies about that. And I also heard last time that I've had a bit of issues with my cursor, so hopefully my laser pointer allows you to see a bit better. Without further ado, we are going to be covering the basics and terms for economics first up. Then we're doing the PPC and the factors of production, the business cycle and government response to like contractionary, expansionary policies, stuff like that. The circular flow of income and the aggregate supply and demand. And then the last thing we're doing is analyzing economic data. All right, well, with that being said, I'm going to move on to the terms and the basics. So, what is economics and what is scarcity? So I'm going to put this like quite simply for you. That economics is the study of scarcity, which I'm covering next up, and it's like the allocation of resources that are like rare and limited. So for an example, let's go apples, right? Like there are a limited amount of apples in the world, but everyone might want an apple simultaneously. Um, and if they want that, like, if they want apples now and they need it simultaneously, then, but there's only a finite amount of apples, then only like a certain amount of people can get the apples. So what economics does is pretty much it's like allowing a decision making for like how the apples are going to get given to people basically. And scarcity is the other point I mentioned. So scarcity is like if something has a demand for it, but it's greater than its availability, or if the resource in question is uh, like if it's finite, like if it's a limited amount of the resource, then it'll be considered scarce. I've got an example here, like where if you take air underwater, right? Obviously, there's like not a lot of air when you're underwater, like when you're going scuba diving. So that is why you'll pay for oxygen and like scuba diving air when you go scuba diving. But if you're on the surface of the earth, you're like not paying to breathe yet. But that's obviously because in the sense of scarcity, air is like very, very available. Whereas if we were on planet Earth, let's say a million years from now, where like our atmosphere might be mostly carbon dioxide, you could say air is scarce. Okay, the fundamental economic problem. So the fundamental economic problem is pretty much a suggestion by the economists in the economic theory, where um, wants, like your desires, are unlimited, but in order to like satisfy that desire, the resources to do so are limited. So, for an example, like you might want 800 tons of mangoes, okay? But obviously there might only be 1,000 tons produced in, let's call it Queensland, okay? But you want 800 tons. So there's obviously a limited amount to that want, like that you can get. Like you're not going to get your 800 tons of mangoes unless you convince everyone to give you the mangoes. But that's what I mean. Like your want might be unlimited, but in order to satisfy that want, there are only limited amount of resources to do so. The next one I need to cover is how does something have like economic value? So it'll have economic value if it meets two conditions. First of all, it must be wanted by people and it must have like a demand to it. So a good example might be a car. So a lot of people want a car and there's obviously a demand for cars. That's why you pay 20 odd grand or more for a brand new car. And it must be scarce or limited in nature. So effectively, there's only a finite amount of it, like it only exists to a certain extent, and there's not an infinite amount of it. Negative economic value. So negative economic value is something that you'll pay to get rid of, whether it's a good or a service or anything that you don't want and you'll pay to get rid of. I've got here sewage, rubbish. Interesting one. If you have body fat and you want to get rid of it, liposuction. You can call liposuction like a service that you'll pay to get rid of it, where fat would be negative economic value to you. Opportunity cost is another definition you guys are going to need to know. So if you want like the exact definition for it, which is probably the best idea for the exam, it's the best alternative decision that is foregone when a choice is made. And what that means is, so like if you have two like products, right? And you have to choose between one or the other, then foregone means like it's past your decision. Like you're now not able to take it back and get that thing when the initial decision has been made. So an example here is like 1 banana for 2 oranges, right? I can either buy 1 banana or 2 oranges, or I can either like produce 10 bananas for 6 oranges, but using that scale, 9 bananas for 8 oranges. So it depends like how many oranges, how many bananas you want to produce. Next up is the ceteris paribus assumption. So ceteris paribus is an assumption that if all other factors are equal, then like whatever you're gonna say. So you'll use it in the context of like the circular flow of income or the business cycle, where you'll be talking about like a government budget or total private expenditure, or anything regarding the CFI, and it allows you to isolate a subject. So by that I mean like if you're only wanting to talk about a government expenditure, then you can say all other factors ceteris paribus, where government expenditure is greater than whatever, you know. But you might also see that in questions, the phrase ceteris paribus. Okay, needs versus wants. So needs are something you require and wants are something you desire. That's the best way you can put it, the most simplest way you can put it. Easy to remember, hopefully it just works like that. If there's going to be a question, it'll probably be like fill in the blank, you require, desire. Pretty easy. The types of wants, there are 3 types. So you're going to have a recurring want, which will be something that is never fully like satisfied. So you know how if you're trying to get a car, it's eventually going to run out of petrol. Like you're going to need to fill up your car in order for it to run, but then it's going to run out of petrol and then you have to fill it up again. So you have to like recurringly keep going back to it. Complementary wants are things that go together, like they're complementary with each other. So an example is like bread and butter. If you have a phone, like phone data and phones, if you buy both at the same time, car and car insurance. There are quite a few good examples of that. And competitive ones are something that is like pretty much identical to the other good that you can substitute for it. So I've got here Coke and Pepsi, because they're pretty much like the exact same thing. You can debate me on this, I don't really mind, but they are pretty much the same thing. Or like 7-Up and Sprite, or like whatever, you know, you can substitute it for another. Next up, we've got the 3 main economic questions, which you just need to know what they are, not how to answer them or anything. That's the job of an economy. So the 3 main questions are what to produce and how much of it to do, how you're going to produce it, and who gets how much of it. So what and how much to produce is like if you're a business and you're going to be like, okay, what am I producing? Like what am I targeting the audience to, and what am I producing for that audience? And how much to produce is like that way you're not having wastage or not enough to fill your market. How to produce it is like the most effective way using the resources you have to produce that. And who gets it and who gets how much of it is like at the end of the day who's paying like whatever price to get whatever. So like obviously you're going to market up luxury goods like Louis Vuitton, like perfumes, handbags, or you might have like a Dior perfume and like Nautica Voyage, for example, or some cheap nasty perfume from Kmart or some shit, I don't know. And pretty much that's going to be like what price are you paying for it? Like if you're going to be paying 150 for a Dior perfume, then obviously only a limited amount of people are going to get that. Whereas if you put a perfume down for 15 bucks, then a lot of people are going to pay for that and try and get it. Consumer sovereignty is pretty much an economic like belief that consumers in a free market are able to control the production patterns. So like they're able to control what and how much the corporation who's producing the good does by how much they spend. So let's say let's go to a perfume example, okay? Again. So let's say there's a really, really good perfume. It's made by Dior and it's 15 bucks for 100 mil. So you will be able to buy that, and everyone will buy that, right? So that's the consumers having very high demand, and that's controlling the production pattern because it's increasing the demand significantly. Whereas if it was like $1,000 for 10 mil and it's bad smelling and no one likes it, then obviously no one's going to buy it, and that's where consumer sovereignty comes in. So it's pretty much like as the consumers as a whole, we can dictate what gets produced, how much, and the economic questions we had before, pretty much. Last thing to do is the paradox of thrift. So the paradox of thrift is another idea similar to what we had before, where if you save more money, like let's say you're in a tough time and you put more money into savings, and then or like other leakages from the economy. So like let's say you're importing more or you're getting taxed more, then the overall aggregate demand, which is like the expenditure, I'm getting to aggregate demand in a couple minutes. So that aggregate demand will decrease. And if you're like slowing down the economy, then obviously your GDP decreases too. And if all of those decrease, then the value of your money that you're saving is decreasing, and it'll just continually have like keep going on like that. So pretty much like it's decreased, and then you put more money into savings, and it's going to keep decreasing. Um, so that's the paradox of thrift. Okay, we've got the PPC and factors of production next. So the PPC is pretty much this curve I've got down here, and it's a production possibility curve. And it's demonstrating that like two goods, so let's say that's like bananas and let's say that's mangoes, okay? So these two goods in the economy can be produced with the current technology, and that line is going to be the maximum amount of that can be produced with the current technology. That's perfect mobility and stuff. So the next thing I need to cover about this PPC is that it has a couple assumptions that you don't need to know for the exam, but probably for a general purpose it might not be too bad to know. And that is that two goods are produced only. So as I said, bananas here, mangoes here. All the resources used to produce those are like perfectly efficient, and you can perfectly like move the resources in order to change like your production. So let's say you're starting out on point B, and then you can perfectly switch to point C like within an instant, pretty much. And the fixed levels of tech and resources means that you cannot like exceed that line. Like that is the absolute maximum that you can like perform and is efficient. So any point down here, like below this line, is inefficient, but obtainable. So you can achieve this point like if you want, but there isn't really a point because it's inefficient, and it means like you're wasting your resources pretty much. Whereas any point up here is like you would love this point. If you got this point, that's beautiful. But because like you've got a fixed level of tech and a fixed level of resource, that means you can only go up to like this curve here. Like you cannot exceed that curve. So yeah, hopefully that explains that briefly to you. The four factors of production, we've got land, which pretty much covers every single natural resource that exists. So like fish or land, wood, anything, right? Trees. That's all an example of land. And the income that is earned from land, or like anything made from land, is called rent. So if I was to sell wood, or if I was to chop down a tree and sell wood, not as not as an enterprise or anything, but by myself, then that would be considered rent. Next up, we've got labor. So labor is considered any physical or mental effort such as like trading, um, books, anything like intellectual property, the stock market, anything like that kind of thing. But it's like an effort that you've made to create it. That would be considered a wage or an income. And that's also like if you work for a company. Capital will be any resource that that's man-made that we've developed to make something further. So like the assembly line or a hammer, washing machines. You could even say company vehicles like cars and stuff. And the income from that is called interest. And the last thing to cover is enterprise. So enterprise is a collective effort of all the previous factors. So like capital, labor, land, all of the above or two or more. And it's like an entrepreneurial effort. So that means someone's came along and like grouped all these together. Like they've hired laborers to cut down trees to sell for wood, and they process the wood on a production plant. And all that income from that is called profit. Up next, we have the business cycles and the government/RBA and how they respond to like TROs and stuff like that. So in the business cycle, one of the last things we learned, it's pretty much like this squiggly line that represents like the current stage of the economy and also the previous stages in the terms of like real GDP, which means like the total amount of like product and good and service that is sold during our economy. And it uses time as like a measure of like period length, I guess you could say. And real GDP is like a y-axis for like what the economy is doing. So the peak, like this peak section here, you'll need to notice for your exam has high inflation. So like your inflation rate will be above 2 to 3%. It will have low unemployment because it needs more people to like supply the work. So your unemployment rate will be 3.5% or below, and it will have high GDP growth. So your high GDP growth will be above 4%. But the opposite down here, like this depression, this trowel, they have low inflation, so your inflation will be like 2% or below. Low GDP growth, which will be 3% and below, but high employment, so your unemployment will be greater than 5%. And then it can swing back up, and it can swing down and it can swing back up, and that swing here is impacted by the decisions of the RBA and the government, which I'm covering on the next slide like very shortly, but pretty much they can control like what stage the economy is in by their policies. So the government reacts to peaks in the economy, like that peak I had in the previous slide. So to the peak in the economy, that means that the government has been doing an expansionary policy. So they're taxing less to the people, but they're spending more on the government expenditure. Like they are investing more money into public infrastructure, hospitals, education, but they're not taxing as much as they normally are, or they are taxing the same, but they're putting a lot more money into expenditure. And the RBA, or the Reserve Bank, will decrease the interest rate, and in doing so, that means like your money when you put it into the bank isn't making as good of a return as it normally would. So they are discouraging people saving, but they are promoting spending. So it's cheaper to buy things, but and it's worse to save things. However, if you're in a trough in the economy, that means the government has like done a contractionary policy, like they're contracting the economy, and that means they will tax more and they'll be spending less on government expenditure. So this is extreme, but if they were to cut like Centrelink spending, then that might put our economy in like a recession, in a trough. And that's because they're doing it as a contractionary policy to slow down our economy. From the RBA though, what they'll do is in order to cause that, they'll have increased interest rates. So they would have encouraged savings, would have made people save more money, but they would have discouraged them from like buying houses and cars and stuff like that by increasing the interest rate. So it means it's like more expensive to pretty much like do whatever. But the inverse would be said. So if they're in a trough, right? Like if they're stuck down here, what they're going to do is they're going to do the opposite. Like they're going to do what this is going to do, and if that's in too much of a peak, they're going to do this. Okay, the three main economic systems that we have are fully planned, unplanned, and semi-planned. And for fully planned, they have like very high levels of government intervention, and that means that the government is like impeding on the operation of normal businesses to make the decisions on like who gets what and how much is produced, so on and so forth. But there's also no free market, so that means like there's no room for you to go out and like trade your goods. So in Australia, like you know how we have companies that like market different prices, like Coles and Woolies have different prices for a block of feta, for example, or bread. Whereas fully planned would mean there'd be like no competition apart from the government. So the government would determine exactly how much bread everyone got or how much feta or whatever. So a good example of this is Russia. Maybe around the 1940s, they're a bit more capitalistic now, but they used to be very fully planned. The next one is semi-planned. So this is like around moderate levels of government intervention, which means the government does impact some of the decisions, but it's like ultimately up to the producers and consumers of like who answers the economic questions. The good thing about semi-planned economies is they still have all the public goods and public infrastructure that a fully planned does. So like they've got free healthcare and stuff, but they've also got a free market. And an example is our homeland, Australia. For unplanned, that's like America or Saudi Arabia kind of thing, where like the government doesn't intervene at all, and it's entirely up to the consumer to answer, like consumer and businesses to answer those economic questions earlier. The market's entirely free, so you can jack up prices or lower them however much you want. But the downside is there's no public infrastructure, so there's like no room for you to like get catered for in a hospital without paying money. That's probably more American lenient. I would say Saudi is a little bit more semi-planned than fully unplanned. Okay, the CFI and aggregate demand slash supply. So a circular flow of income here, we've got five sectors. So you've got households or consumers, firms or business, and then you've got your financial sector, your government sector, and your overseas sector. And all of these sectors have leakages on like this side coming into them and injections coming out of them. One important thing just to remember is you've got like your real flow here, which are these like central arrows where your resources will be given to firms. So that'll be factors of production like land, labor, capital, enterprise. But in turn, firms will give you like a good or service that you've used your factors of production to do. The last thing you need to know is the equilibrium, like how that works. So if all of these injections, right, plus your consumer is equal to your consumer plus all the injections from your leakages, then that means that the system is in equilibrium. So if C is 100, S is 200, I is 200, T is like 300, G is 300, M is like 100, and X is 100, then you can say the equilibrium would be, oh, the economy is in equilibrium, because you just pretty much add those numbers together, and if they equal each other, that's an equilibrium. If that number is greater than this number, or like leakages is greater than injection, then that means the economy is like in surplus. And then if it's the other way around, injection is greater than leakage, then the economy is in a deficit. Aggregate demand and the consumption factors. So aggregate demand is like the collective demand for goods and services at any point in time of the economy. So on that CFI back there, you'll pretty much have like all of your injections into the economy, and that will make up your aggregate demand. But the key thing here is the exports are minus the imports. And that is just to balance out that foreign sector, whereas everything else can be controlled inside the Australian economy. And that's about all you need to know for aggregate demand, how to calculate it and roughly what it is. And then you've got different factors for the different industries. So for consumption, you'll have like your want for luxuries, your level of disposable income, your cash rate, your need for basics, and that's probably about it. A couple more things, but that's like what consumption would be. So consumers buying things from producers. For importing, that means that the household consumption of like goods and stuff is high, and the Australian Aus dollar rate for us is favorable, or it's a high AUD rate. But for export, it's the opposite. So for export, if we have a lower Aus dollar rate, but a good demand for good and service, then we'll export goods away. For investment, it pretty much means that like the investor has high confidence that the investment will do well. And if the interest rate is low too, then that also helps, because that's going to obviously encourage people to spend more than save. And the last thing for government expenditure is like cyclical spending, so money that is spent on things like Centrelink and other government benefits, structural spending, so things like infrastructure and whatnot, and disasters. So obviously spending more money on natural disasters than whatnot. So like if a cyclone came through, obviously you know how there's like government benefits to that. Like everyone gets $400 in affected areas, or 1,000 or whatever it is. So that's an example of a factor for government expenditure, because the government is trying to rectify like what's happened in that area of the economy. Analyzing economic data. So that's our last thing we've got to do now, and I'll be quite brief here. So just a quick like dot points on how to analyze. So first of all, you should have a look for any trends, like if you've got any patterns that are occurring. So if there's like, you can see GDP growth occurring, or inflation rating that are increasing or decreasing, unemployment, so on. That'll be pretty easy. I've got an example in the next slide over. What you then want to do is you can compare data if there's another figure there for you. If not, you can kind of just gauge where the state of the economy is by that graph, and then you can influence like what might be causing and affecting that, which I'm getting to in a second. If you want to, I would recommend calculating any like percentage change, or how much the economy's grown over whatever period. Then your causes and effect for like why that has happened. And then the final thing is you just like demonstrate the impact. Like how's that issue impacted the graph? How's it impacted the economy? Sorry, not the graph. That's just me being silly. So, for example, I've got the GDP growth here. So I'm just going to grab a pen. We'll go highlighter first, and we'll have a look at any sections that look important. So obviously right here, this is like the first thing I'm seeing, this trough here, and then a huge peak that's following. So that's going to be quite important. I'm going to say we'll be looking at like data relevant to like what's happening like quite relevantly too. So that whole peak is probably going to be quite important. That's still part of that recession there. Otherwise, everything else here looks pretty standard for GDP growth, but this whole like section here is going to be like probably where you want to be talking about. And I think that should be good. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to have a look at any trends. So you can say that like, see how this is bouncing up and down here? It's like zing, 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 zing. But it's all kind of like hovering around 3.54%. So you can say from 1994 to, it probably stops about here. So from 1994 till early 2010s, the average GDP growth per year hovered around 3.7 to 4%. So that's going to be your first trend. Then your second trend is onwards of about 2013, there's been a steady rate of about 2%, sorry, before 2020, where in 2020 a very large jump of what appears to be about 10% occurred into the GDP growth of the economy. And then it has then rebounded back up significantly over the course of 2 years by what's that, nearly 16% by the looks of it. And then it's continued a recessional trend. So right there, I've identified a trend, and then I've given like a bit of background behind it. So obviously you're going to write that out when you're doing your exam. And then the next thing you want to do is you're going to probably want to calculate like what's happening with the percentage change, which I kind of just gave values there already, but you can say like there's been a percentage change from 2% down to 8%, then a rebound back up to 8 point, maybe that's more like 10%, but you can say overall that's been a percentage change of whatever that is, like actually, you don't even have to say that. You could say like per the year it's increased by about 8% following 2020 due to like the government spending. So if you remember how the government spent a lot of money into trying to inject the economy with job seeker and job seeker, job keeper, and a couple of other government things too. So all that spending would have stimulated the economy, and it would have like artificially boosted our GDP growth. But in order to try and get our metrics back to normal, after this peak from then to about 2022, 2023, we've tried to achieve a 4% growth. But from here, like this 4% growth, our government has experienced like a recessional trend in policy. And this is probably where it's handy to have a bit more knowledge. And so you're going to just want to talk about like why that's happened. So have a look at like recently in the past 2-3 years, like what the government has done. I definitely am going to be doing that tonight, and it might just be useful just to see like what's happening for that to occur. And I also recommend analyzing more of these types of graphs. So I found this on the RBA chart pack. So I'll write that out for you here. RBA chart pack. So have a look there if you want heaps of data. They've got GDP growth, inflation, so on and so forth. I reckon that'll probably be quite good to have a look at for analyses. Anyways, you just want to explain like this trend. So our government's been in a recessional policy for like 2 years, as you can see by the percentage dropping from 4 to 1%. And this is because like you can say the RBA has increased interest rate. Like obviously what's causing this, okay? Like if you remember from the previous slide, recessions and contractionary policies means that the government is spending less. They are increasing their taxation. They are increasing the interest rate if that's from the RBA perspective, and that explains what's happening in that graph. Anyways, thank you for tuning in to the QC guy. Hope you found it useful, and if you have any questions, let me know, and I'm more than happy to answer them. Anyways, with that being said, have a wonderful day, evening, or night.